There he is. He is right on time. Hello.
Hey, what's up, Jared?
Hey, how's it going? Let me get this. Make sure this looks good. Should look fine. Say a couple things so I can get your levels right.
One thing, two things.
That's perfect. All right. Guys. Boom. How does it look? Oh, you know what? I need to do this. Cool. Kevin, thanks for joining.
Of course. Happy to sit down and chat. Jared, how are you doing?
Good, man. I'm excited. First things first, we had a giveaway count resting on what you were going to say your favorite food is.
And I just...
So I was going to say, I don't specify what favorite is. You can, whatever your answer is, if anyone guessed it.
Favorite food? Sandwiches.
Sandwiches. You know what was funny is I said with guys like Kevin, because I was like, because he makes it's always something extremely simple.
Yeah.
I was like, like he always has these crazy foods, and then he comes on and it's like mac and cheese or something, and then that's amazing.
I've had many conversations that are kind of, you know, if you were on a desert island and you could only eat one thing for the rest of your life type of conversations, right? And that made it very clear in my mind that sandwiches are just like, well, it's a very versatile answer.
I was just thinking that I guess it's kind of a suitcase. Like you could say a hamburger is a sandwich.
Yep.
Like there's a lot you could kind of put in there once you.
I'm not trying to wrap in like hot dogs and tacos and stuff, but like sandwiches, there's just a lot of sandwiches out there. I could eat them forever.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, let's get started with the poker stuff. I think to kick it off, just you want to tell us like a bit about your background, like for anyone who happens to not know about you, like what got you started in poker? How did you get to be the Kevin Rabichow?
Sure, totally. Yeah. I mean, I'd honestly be shocked if there wasn't at least someone who's never heard of me. So I'll give the quickest overview. So I started poker in about 2006, 2007, depending on, you know, how seriously I was taking it. And I was playing online throughout college, kind of bouncing between different formats until I found Heads Up No Limit in about 2009. And that was the format that stuck for me as a specialty all the way up until, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. I still play Heads Up No Limit you know, from time to time. And most recently, I guess in 2020, playing the Legends Showdown, but that's jumping ahead a bit. I was specializing in Heads Up No Limit for almost a decade there, and over that time I got heavily involved in coaching as well. I produced videos with headsupsitandgo.com and then later Run It Once, and that sort of became like those two things I think became my primary identity in the poker world, either being a Heads Up No Limit player or being a poker coach.
Gotcha.
So that kind of brings us to now, where I play tournaments as my main format when I am playing, but when I'm at home, I'm mostly coaching. So that's been my focus for the last couple months.
Yeah, I think your transition to tournaments went like under recognized by a lot of people, because I remember watching when you were doing you were doing an interview after your Heads Up session at the World Series, and I think it was whoever was interviewing you was like, yeah, like, are you going to do any tournaments or anything like that? And I think at that point you'd been like, tournaments had been your primary focus for a while. And yeah,
I think I mean, a lot of people know me because of the content that I've produced. And I think my reputation, especially for Run It Once viewers, has really just been Heads Up for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't run into a lot of people who recognize me because like I played some high profile match or like was at some big final table or whatever, right? Like that's not really what I'm known for. I think it's mostly for the content.
Yeah.
And it's only quite recently that content has started to cover tournaments as well. So
yeah, maybe I
think it's reasonable unless, you know, someone's kind of you think that's why the content is.
Yeah. You if you walked around and said something, someone would be like,
yeah,
oh, that's Kevin. But
I have gotten that before because it's kind of a new thing, at least for me in training videos, to show webcam. I probably before I started producing my course this year, I don't think I ever had webcam in my videos. So like about if someone recognized me at a poker table, it probably was because they recognized the way I was talking,
Yeah.
which is funny.
I was gonna ask you. So you were doing heads up primarily. Was sit and goes primarily like where you would play, or did you do heads up cash much as well?
So let's say like way early on, maybe 2009 until 2011, I was mixing between the two. And a lot of the community that I met was through sit and goes, but a lot of the volume that I started to play in the years after that was cash. So I was pretty much a cash specialist, let's say like post Black Friday, let's say like
Okay.
2011 onward. But when I joined headsupsitandgo.com and when I was kind of learning heads up format, I was bouncing between the two. But definitely I had far more success in the cash games.
Gotcha. When do you think it was that like you realized, oh, this could be like a profession? I guess two questions. One, would it be like this is probably a profession for me? And then the other being like, no, I'm actually like really competitively good at this. Like I'm in the upper echelon of players at this. Because I'd imagine those would be two sort of different moments you might realize.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of framing it. I think I felt the competitive status earlier than I felt the professional status.
Oh, interesting.
Because when I was playing in college, like I didn't really think about like I wasn't someone who really was weighing like dropping out of college versus getting a job versus playing poker or whatever. Like I was just kind of doing what I was doing. I went to class, I played poker, I studied poker, I studied economics. I just kind of did all that stuff, and that was all normal to me. But I considered myself a good poker player, and I was like super active in the discussion community. And I think that I felt well before I was like financially reliant on poker, I felt that I was competitive and I was like I don't know, ahead of my competition, right? I don't know when I guess I started to feel like it was a profession when I just like left home and moved into an apartment in Toronto where I was playing poker and doing nothing else. That was certainly different. That was a full commitment to the game.
This kind of naturally leads into one of the questions I had slated for a little later, but we'll just ask it now, is because it's interesting to think about how I think in certain ways that at every sort of generation of poker player, you and I are the same age, but are different generations of poker player, I would say, right? But
Sure.
how they benefit from one thing or another. And it seems, one thing I've thought about in your example, for example, it seems beneficial to not have this sort of pressure to be successful, a professional, like to be even be thinking about those things,
For sure.
you know, like
Yeah.
whereas today there's, I think once people who get into it, you're way more inclined to be like, oh, I'm getting into this to be professional. But at the
Yeah.
same time, there's way more information today, right? There's so much more that to learn about. I guess it's just, how do you think you benefited? Like, do you feel like you benefited specifically from that? Like you, even though you had less of a clear idea, you know, how did the environment benefit you specifically?
Yeah, I mean, as far as just like the freedom to do what I was doing to get better at poker, I think that it was really valuable in that regard because there was no real like second guessing about the process that I was going through. Like I wasn't, I don't know, something I might do now that I didn't feel pressured to do when I was learning the game was like tracking my balance between study and play, or like logging my hours in a way where I was trying to optimize for earn, right? Like I could dive into study and not really care how fast it got me somewhere. I could like dive into playing and not really care how far back it set me in my study because I was ahead of the game and also had no pressure to earn the money while I was in college. So that sort of freedom to just like do whatever I was motivated to do at that time
Yeah.
meant that I was able probably to progress a lot faster than I would have if I was constrained in some way where I'm trying to calculate all the trade-offs, right, that I might be calculating now.
Yeah. I think it also frames it in a way where you're not, you're closer to the money, right? Like your thought process is close. You're directly just correlating success or failure to success or failure, you know, in that sense. And one of the things now that I think hurts a lot of people is there's so many artificial things to compare yourself to, right? Like, did I do what a solver would do? Or even because of publicity of poker players, it's like, did I do what better players than me would do, right? It's like easier to sort of watch players, compare players, and like think like, oh, would X player do this action? And I guess it seems nice to be in a environment where you don't know as many professional players and like,
so, that was definitely a privilege. And I mean, and then it sets you up, like, or at least in my case, it set me up to be able to sort of preach that mentality, it's easier for me now to be in a position where I'm still kind of detached from the money or detached from the comparisons or detached from whatever, right? Like that's still there, but that pressure never built in the early years. So like now, even though the money does matter, and even though I'm making those kind of like comparisons now, I think I'm just in like a better mental place as a result of coming up in that way.
Yeah, now I think it's become much more it was a big part of my personal, like, it's, still is part of my own personal poker journey of like reminding myself what it is, especially in game, like, am I making a decision as a comparison to some like theoretical, like hypothetical player, or am I truly just trying to make the decision that I think is going to make the best money, And I think for a lot of, we both coach, and for a lot of the people I coach right now, that's a big thing too, is just getting them out of the thought process of like, what would a solver do in this spot? And it's not to say that you shouldn't be doing what a solver would do, right? It's just to be saying like, that's not the comparison. That's not the mental space, I think, that produces the best play. So this feeds nicely into this too. Do you think there's something that like you do differently from not just players at every level, but players at your level? Like, do you still think you do something unique, or is basically, would you say everyone who you view as at your level is approaching the game in basically the same way?
Yeah, it's, I guess first I'll answer just with regards to like the way that I play.
Right.
Because there's something else that's on my mind. I think that the way that I play is not particularly unique among the competition that I'm up against. I think that through conversations that I've had with like, my opponents, with other high stakes players, I think it's clear to me that the majority of them are studying the same type of like background material that I'm studying, and they're executing in a similar like headspace to the way that I'm executing, right? So they're doing this blend of like theoretical knowledge and exploitative attempts. And I think that that's, maybe unique when you compare high stakes to other competition, to lower competition, but I don't think, like me compared to the others that I'm playing against, I don't think that's particularly unique. What I have found that I do better, or at least that I do differently than my opponents, is the way that I like organize my I don't want to say my routine, but like the way that I prepare is different, I think. Especially in that I think for people who are equally emphasizing theory as myself, I think I spend a lot less time studying than they do, if that makes sense. Like I think that I've for the most part noticed that a strength of mine is studying effectively, or at least studying in a way that like focuses on the signal and tunes out the noise a lot better than my competition does. So I think that that's a competitive advantage that I've only recently realized I have, and is something that I'm trying to like really lean into in the way that I go forward with my work and also with my coaching and stuff, right? I'm sure you know that this is something I emphasize in my coaching, but that was something that it took me a lot of like one-on-one interactions with students to realize how much like better I was approaching that part of the game compared to others. Yeah,
I think that's a really valuable thing. One of the things I would say that's probably where I spend my coaching time most with people is just talking about studying and talking about getting the most out of it. I think one of the things I always tell people is like just always go into study with a clear goal in mind and clear criteria that tells you you've accomplished that goal. I think that's just like that alone helps. And like, yeah, I think it's tough because that's interesting to say that, because I think of when when a lot of people, tell me what you think of this. I'm kind of just thinking out loud, but like I think that is what trickles down to even a lot of the sort of shotgun style studying that we see, is because a lot of content that gets created, I think, is less pointed, it's less direct, it's less exact. And I think there are people who videos stand out for that reason, and I think yours probably definitely outrun it once or some of those. And there are other people who create videos that are like, oh, this is like really to the point and like really concise and really efficient. And I think it's really unique to see that. That's awesome. So along that approach, someone actually asked in chat, isn't it hypocritical to say plug leaks but don't play like a solver? Which is good, because that brings this next question to mind, which I was talking about. Strategy building versus playing like a solver is my next question. Like, what are the strengths and weaknesses? I don't know if you quite get what I'm getting at, because they seem similar, but of these two different approaches. Like building a strategy, meaning something I've constructed and a game plan that I have, which is convenient plug for your new course, the game plan. But like having this game plan versus going into a game and thinking, I'm going to get to each spot, I'm going to have all of these ideas about how solvers, create decisions, like blockers and all these ideas, and these are going to inform my decision in the moment, and that will get me to what is correct. How do you view these two different approaches?
Yeah, I think, you're kind of outlining what I think is different about my approach compared to a lot of my peers, because I think that there's some very good players who are very well studied, who have mostly spent their time with solvers looking at individual scenarios or like little snapshots of GTO.
Yeah.
And they've connected the dots in whatever way that they've connected the dots that like make sense to them. But they don't necessarily like take all of that information and consolidate it into some sort of like tangible strategy, right? Like a written strategy or a well organized approach. So like when I study, I'm looking at, let's say, how to approach the flop check back, situation holistically, right? So I'm thinking about not only how do my opponents play after I check back the flop, but also how does the solver tend to play after I check back the flop, and like what makes sense given all of that. And I'll try to trim that down into like something I can remember that says, okay, once I've checked back the flop, generally speaking, I'm going to be sticky because the population bluffs it. But also at the same time, if they check to me twice, I'm going to be way too aggressive because I think that they fold too much, or I don't get check raised, or whatever it is, right? And I've just like got this kind of mental picture of what my strategy looks like when I'm in that situation, when I'm actually playing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of my opponents will or a lot of players who are, taking the other approach that you described, are going to get into that check spot. They're going to face a bet, and then just like in the moment, it's going to be this, what's that beautiful mind GIF or whatever, of like all the equations floating, right? Or it's like bet sizing, blockers, my hand, this board texture, our positions, and like everything's happening in the moment. And like if you are trying to do that in real time, 8 tabling online tournaments, or like whatever it is, or playing a super high roller live in like a high pressure situation with time banks, I mean, good luck to you, right? Like you're very often gonna come up with like, you're just gonna ask yourself a lot of questions, and then you're gonna come up with whatever answer you come up with, and the chance that that's actually related to the solver output, or the chance that that's actually like what you were trying to accomplish is pretty slim. I think you're just it's a coin flip in the end.
Yeah, I think it also inclines you very much to just overlook something obvious too.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think when you have all of that conditioned, you have this I think it inclines you. I learned this from, there are a few things that a few people have asked, so I'll mention how you and I got to know each other, and it was through the group course that you offered. That was like our first coaching session, and it was like in a group context. You offered, like, I can't remember, it was like $1,000 or $1,500, and it was like a month small group of people studying together. And I remember one of the first things was asked was talking about, and I've relayed this a ton since then to my own students and to other people, but it was like, what do you think when you're in a bluff catching spot? Like, what are your considerations when bluff catching? Mm-hmm. And I was one of, surprise, the more vocal of the people in this group. So I spat off like, 9 things immediately. And somewhere in there was the consideration, like, is the spot over bluffed or not?
Yeah.
And which is funny because that's, from a dollar's perspective, the only thing that really matters, right? Like, is the spot over bluffed or not? But there are so many spots, I think, that if you're not doing that, there's just like these really, as soon as I switched, that's just the priorities at which I thought through things. There were just moments where it's like, this obviously must be over bluffed. Like, there's just so many reasons to believe the spot's over bluffed. And yeah, I think relying on that, even though I mean, it's impressive the degree to which people understand theory, though. Like, some people, like, they really do get all the threads being pulled in different directions in certain spots, but
I agree. And I will say, like, I've continued to teach that same thought process to other groups or to other students. And occasionally the pushback I get, which I think is very valid, is, well, what if I don't know what the population does here? Or what if I don't know what my opponent tends to do here? And you will run into those spots, right? Like, knowing the answer to that question is a frequent situation for me, and I'm sure for other players it's a frequent situation. Yeah. That doesn't mean we want to like push that out of the thought process. It just means we need like a contingency plan for those situations, right? So studying theory and understanding approximately how the solution would look in a situation sort of like the spot you're in is like the level of detail that I strive for myself. To deal with those situations when I'm not sure, like when I don't have an intuition for which way to lean, right? So if I check back the flop and I face a pot size turn bet and I just don't really know on this board or from this player or whatever whether they're bluffing too much or too little, then I trust my study.
Yeah.
Like, I trust the amount of study that I've put in for that kind of spot to say, like, yeah, this seems like the right kind of hand to call, or
absolutely,
this seems like the right kind of hand to fold or whatever. But I try to make sure that it's a hierarchy that starts with like, make the best decision in the moment, and then move your way towards theory kind of reluctantly.
Yeah. And I mean, I also tell people too, like, look, of course, like, you're not going to know in plenty of spots. So one, you can, there's multiple approaches. Naturally, the better the hand that you have, you can give yourself like a higher confidence rating. Like, if I'm in a top 10 percentile hand of mine, like, you should know more likely or not or whatever that the spot's really not going to be overbluffed. They're really not going to be value betting a hand worse than you, or like whatever. But also, one thing that I've mentioned, you can tell me what you think of this. It's important to even be asking yourself that and to start thinking about that, because it's a skill in and of itself, right? Like, trying to seek out spots where it's like, this is likely overbluffed for X, Y, and Z reason. I think a lot of people are lacking even the hands of experience where they've been considering that. And so then they get to spots and they don't know because they haven't been flexing that. They haven't been putting themselves in the situation where, like, I should be calling every bluff catcher here, or I should be folding every one. And because I haven't been considering that approach at all, when pushed to do so, I just have no clue what spots are which. And so I think sometimes, even though you don't know, one of the things I've started working with telling my students too is like, just push yourself to make that decision more often, because it will reward you. Like, you'll get better and better and better at it, and there'll be more spots that become clearer. Like, you're going to be wrong a ton is what I tell people. Like, you're going to be wrong a ton, but like, working that skill is so valuable in my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting that you put it that way, because it reminds me that the way that I learned the game, I spent a number of years playing heads up before there were answers to these kinds of spots. And if you went back and read like a 2+2 thread on the Heads Up No Limit forum that was talking about, like, should I call, pot size bet turn, pot size bet river in this spot, like, there'd be 20 replies and not a single person would talk about minimum defense. Not a single person would talk about theoretical bet sizing. They would just be talking about you look strong because of this, therefore I would fold, or you look weak because of this, therefore I would call.
Exactly.
Or players don't tend to bluff when this card comes, so I would fold, or players
Exactly.
tend to bluff too much when that card comes, so I would call. It was the whole dialogue.
Yeah.
So I got very good at thinking from the point of view that humans, when put in situations, follow rules, and those rules tend them towards a certain type of bias, right? Like they tend to bluff a bit too much when the board looks like this. They tend to bluff not enough when the board looks like that. So sometimes like the way that we talk about over bluffing or under bluffing, it sounds like we're just saying, oh, well, look at the data. Like, don't you have it handy on your, on your cell phone or whatever? Like, can't you just look up 200 million hands? Like, no, a lot of people don't have access to that information, but you can intuit, or you can learn to kind of track the method of hand reading that your opponents are using, or the method of decision making that your opponents are using. And that can lead you to the same sorts of answers. Like, oh, I do think that they would bluff too much here because of the way that they think about this spot, or the way that my image is here, or the way that, the way that this line looks to the average player.
Exactly. Yeah. And the way I've been putting it to people is just like, one, you're not making the decision against this person in particular necessarily. You're trying, you're making it about people in general. Yep. And also, I've told people, like, just bet on human nature. Like, how hard is it for you to go against your instincts in a spot? Right? In a spot where you just know you should bluff because you have 5 high, or whatever. Like, how hard is it to shut that down because you think the spot's overcalled? It's very difficult, And so I was like, so just bet on human nature. Like, if people have a lot of hands that are uncomfortable to fold, they're overcalling the spot. It's like they're going to call too much, Like, if 50% of your folds come from top pair in a spot that the line hasn't been that active or whatever, like, it's not happening, or whatever reason, or like just count on human nature and don't overthink it. And the more, again, I think it's just an important skill. Like, I've seen myself since, coaches with you in the beginning, the more I've been like flexing that, the more I've been thinking of it. And it also, for me, it felt like, I don't know, I felt like the chains got let off because I was inclining to think that way. Typically, I came from a live background, right? So, like, I was inclining myself to think that way for a lot, but I just thought it was bad poker, right? Like, I just thought that's not how poker's played now. That's not how online poker's played. And so for me, it was just like, it felt so freeing to be like, no, just like do what you think makes money, which is funny. But,
that's great.
Let's see. I guess we kind of talked about that. So I guess this is a good question. What do you think is the importance of clarifying where your edge is in the game, like of like having an idea of like where your edge comes from?
I mean, I think it's very important. I'll kind of talk through what I'm like how I would use this if I was working with a new student, because a lot of times this was one of the, I don't think this is on my like intake forms anymore, but when I used to do consultations in a different way than I do now, I would ask this question as part of like just understanding how someone's performing, or they think they're performing in the game that they're playing right now. And I would get a lot of answers. I mean, the variety of answers that I would get about like, what do you think your edge comes from? Or like, why do you think you're better than your opponents? The variety of answers was massive. It was actually quite interesting to me to see like how differently everyone saw that question. Because to me, like, the quantifiable edges, like the ones that are very easy to be sure of, I guess I should say, are the ones that are like, oh, well, I know that my opponents fold too much in these spots, so I always bluff them. Or I know that my opponents are too tight pre-flop, so I play too aggressive. Like tactics, right? Like little advantages there. And that's one that I think is actually like quite rare for someone to tell me as their answer. Like that's the type of answer that when I put it together I was expecting, or like it was the way that I thought about edge, was like tactical counters. And the answers I was getting was so much more like, I think I'm better at milking the fish in the game, or like I think I'm better at controlling my execution, like controlling tilt, or I think I'm better at, and like these are valid skills.
Yeah,
Like
of course.
I'm describing like very valid ways to find edge.
Yeah.
It was just interesting to me that so many people's answer to that question were qualitative and not quantitative,
Sure.
right? Like the edge that they saw in their game was sort of this idea that, well, I know how to do this thing, and my opponents have shown a propensity to not know how to do that thing. And I think this is a little dangerous, right? Because we're really just trusting our intuition on something that's hard to pin down. Like we're in that realm of saying we have an edge simply because like, oh, I'm smarter than them, or like, oh, I just get it and they don't get it, right? Like in some cases I was getting answers that were as vague as that, and that was, to me, that was more of a red flag, right? That's like you might actually just be a losing player type of response, because it's so vague that it makes it clear to me that they're just like completely unsure of what they're better at. So I think it's really valuable. It's a bit of a reality check. I've moved more in the direction of like evaluation, like a more thorough evaluation than these types of questions. But I think it is for a lot of players a reality check to just like stop in their tracks and think like, okay, I've believed that I'm better than my opponents, but why am I better than my opponents? Like actually having to talk through it can be sobering, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was the first question you asked in the group session we did. I think it was one of the first things was like, where does your edge come from? And I think it was a very good, I feel so attacked right now, says somebody in chat. I was smirking, by the way, because someone said, is that garbage behind me? Not because your answer was very funny, but
good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a really, you asked that in the beginning, and even then, I've always been sort of a good communicator, so which is bad for me because it makes me seem like I know something when I don't. And I remember then like giving what I thought was a good answer about like, well, you make money when people, bluff too much and you call, and like giving like what I thought was a good answer. But looking back on it, it really wasn't, my experience wasn't really connected to the reality of a quantitative edge, right? It wasn't really connected to the fact of like, yeah, when you're, there's this gap between what we have in like what we think is a good play and when your intuition sort of catches up with the statistical reality of where money comes from, if that makes sense. And I think the closer it's very difficult for the human mind to sort of close that gap, because we're so bad at statistics. But the closer you get to like knowing that like statistically, I talk about this with my students too a lot. For example, like what does bluff catching correctly at 25% pop bet feel like? And I always tell people it feels like losing almost always. Like that's what it feels like, right? It feels like losing the pot almost always. And knowing that for example, you have an edge bluff catching in spots like that, knowing that it's going to result in you losing always, like knowing that that's where your edge lies though, and what that edge should feel like, it's so valuable because it gives you like a sense of confidence when no matter how the result of that decision goes, it's like it really gives you an idea of like you're just closer to the reality of the game. And that was a big reality check for me of starting. The more we started talking about it, the more it was like, man, where am I actually outplaying people? Like where am I making decisions where in the aggregate this is coming together to make money? And it's just like a reality I've never really connected. And since having connected, like working on thinking about that more and more, the more I talk with people, the more I notice like I've spoken with people who I'm a part of this tournament study group. This is funny. I'm sure they're in the chat too. I'm a part of this tournament study group, and I don't play tournaments anymore. I played for a little bit, but I don't play tournaments. And I'm constantly, they're like trying to get me to buy into like, like a high limit tournament or something. And I'm like, I don't play tournaments. Like I know I will lose money in that because I have no clue. I think a few years ago I would have been like, yeah, let's send it. I'm a good player. I'll be fine, Right. But having worked much more on my cash game, it's like, no, I have no idea that I'm winning. Like I just really don't know. And they feel confident of it, but I'm like, there's no reason to think that. Like I think it really makes me anyway, it's just like it's I think it's very valuable to think about those kind of things.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you connected it with like the feeling of an edge in a certain situation, because I think that's certainly something I haven't like emphasized with my students, but it's something that I'm probably more willing to like accept than they are
Yeah.
on average, right? Because it reminded me of like a common example of a spot that I was finding with my students where the feeling of the edge that they had was very different from the tangible results that they were having in that spot. Was like when they were getting involved in pots with rec players. So when they were like flatting the small blind or like calling behind,
Yeah.
um, limp, like open limping after a limp or whatever, there was this feeling of like just this kind of generally confident sense
Yeah.
that like, oh yeah, there's a bad player in the pot, so of course I'm winning money
Yeah.
by doing this. And pretty much without fail, we would check the results in those situations and they'd just be like hemorrhaging, right?
Yeah.
So and not only hemorrhaging compared to like three betting or squeezing or whatever, but also just like losing money in those spots compared to folding.
Yeah.
Which again is just like that. It's that reality check of, I guess I'm connecting it to the opposite. You were describing like good play will sometimes feel uncomfortable or like will feel shitty, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes bad play feels really comfortable.
Yeah. No,
like,
totally.
so,
Yeah.
sometimes like very, very losing plays can just feel, because so many people are doing them and because it's so acceptable, and because also like the potential loss is quite small and the potential win is quite big. These are just very comfortable things to do, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, like buying scratch tickets is also comfortable if,
Yeah.
if $3 doesn't cost a lot to you.
Yeah.
Like it's just you can make a lot of very small losing bets over your poker career if you don't like analyze them through a more critical lens.
Yeah, I get this all the time, and a big confrontation I had with this was I was primarily playing on ACR, and then was constantly hearing about how good Iggy is and how good the games are in Ignition.
Yeah.
And thought like, oh, I'll just go to Iggy and like double my win rate or whatever, and like it didn't even kind of happen, like right. I put in good volume at ACR and good volume on Iggy, and I was making much less on Iggy. And I remember right. I asked you about it one time when I was like, why would I be losing on Iggy when there's just a worse pool? And you, because you're very kind, were like, well, that's not exactly how it works. Like, it's not just like players are worse so you make more money. Like, in Iggy's anonymous, right? So like, you don't actually know who are the worst players. So your ability, so even if you did have a strategy to like attack worse players, you are capped in your ability to execute that to some degree. Mm-hmm. But you just need a strategy, and I deal with this all the time with people who want to just attack fish. It's like, yeah, getting in pots with fish, I'm sure you're mentioning the same, is good, but you need to know why it's good. Like, where am I getting this edge? Are they overfolding turns by a massive percentage when they like miss c-bet, or are they like, you know what I mean? Like, where are you getting this edge from fish? Because if you just, it's funny because especially some recreational players, they're just willing to make you very uncomfortable. And they're totally willing to like really put the pressure on you, and they're also really willing to like to not fold at times, right? So it's like you could be bluffing it off in spots they're never folding. They could be like, there's so many ways you could be getting in fish, and they could just be owning you because of you just assuming you're better than them. But
yeah. One last quick example that came to mind as you were describing that, I worked with at least 2 or 3 different players who had heads up matches against like very bad players. And these very bad players were all like performing surprisingly well against them. And the like common thread among these students was that they were trying to play too many hands in the big blind against a fish, which was just like, and it just like didn't even cross their mind really before we started looking at it, that they should play tighter than the solution against that particular player, or like tighter than they were used to playing against that particular player, right? So they were playing against guys who would like sometimes 4x the button or like 6x open the button or whatever it was. They'd be opening big, like even if they don't open big, they'd just be blasting post flop, right? They were very, very aggressive, didn't overfold anywhere. The entire way to make money from these fish was to have good hands. And they were just consistently peeling like the king 4 offsuit and making bad hands. So it does, yeah, like even against bad players, I would say especially against bad players, it's quite important to quantify why you're better than them and in what ways they're making mistakes. Because just by asking that question, I think you can quickly build a strategy that's like doubling or tripling your win rate against that player.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And it's just like you said, it's especially important against bad players because that's where your money's probably going to come from anyway, right? Like that's what like most of your money's going to come from. Like of course you can make money against regs, but they're going to, if you guys are basically doing the same thing, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah,
you're capped a lot lower.
Yeah. So we'll shift a little from like strictly more strategic conversations, get into like a little bit more of the topics around poker.
Sure.
So first off, like what made you want to start coaching?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this recently. I did a lot of podcasts this month, and I've had questions adjacent to this a number of times. So I think my answer is starting to get better. I kind of mentioned that when I was learning the game, I was really active on forums, and I think that to some extent, like both my aptitude for like talking strategy and for formulating a thought process, but also my like enjoyment of engaging with community and my enjoyment of like having kind of intellectual conversation around the game that I was learning, naturally led me from like just discussing hands to like teaching those same concepts.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like an endeavor where I was set out to become a professional coach.
Yeah.
It was more like, as I'm learning this game, I'm very inclined naturally to speak about the strategy, to engage in the discourse. And when I just kind of like, the more that I did that, the more I found myself positioned as someone that others were listening to. Right.
Yeah.
And like, once I'm positioned in that place, coaching becomes very natural. It's just like, it's just monetizing what I was already doing. And it just kind of progressively became something I took more and more seriously. I started to get more interested in the, I guess the skill of being a good coach.
Yeah.
As I started to work with like higher level players who were more demanding, or I started coaching sports and like started seeing different sides of what coaching could be or what teaching could be. Right. Doing more formats. You mentioned the group seminars or whatever, right? Like all that started to interest me. So that's been really exciting lately. And I think that's, again, just like playing into my natural desire to intellectuaalize all this stuff, right? To talk strategy, basically.
Did you find the transition awkward at all? I'll say, because when I switched from I was kind of the same, right? Just having conversations with people and to switching to like, well, it started with more and more people. It started becoming more of like, well, we're talking, you're calling me because you want my opinion on this more so. And then it sort of like starts slowly taking this transition. For me, it was very awkward for me to make the jump where it's like these people who I was talking with, suddenly now my time costs money. And like, it was like, that was kind of a weird jump for me to like feel comfortable making.
Did you actually have that with like the same people? Like, were there people you used to talk strategy with who later became your paid students?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I had that experience. Like I've had the experience of moving from mostly talking strategy to mostly being a coach.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think if there's anyone I would have just like started charging at some arbitrary point in time. You know, I don't know if I went through that.
Well, yeah, it was. I went through that with a few people, and it was an awkward. Well, they were good friends, and they were like very supportive, and so it wasn't that awkward. But I remember pressure on myself, feeling like this is kind of a weird transition to be making.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, at some point, like they have to respect what it is that they're asking of you, right? Like, if that is becoming your profession, or if that is your, if it's a source of income for you, then it's kind of just a sign of respect. Like if they want to keep doing that in a formal way. Yeah.
I think it's fair once it actually becomes like, this actually is like a demand on my time outside of normal. Like with most of these people, I still am totally fine to like, talk strategy or whatever. But when it's like, no, I actually have a lot of things going on. And now if you want to have this conversation, like, here's my calendar, here's my, here's the, Yeah, the skill of coaching is something that I'm getting more and more into. It is something I definitely feel I have a lot of room to grow in. I always get people, it's interesting, I get people who are skeptical at why I coach. I don't know if you got this, like people like,
oh, all
if
the
you're
time.
Yeah, if you're a good poker player, why do you coach? Like why do you do that?
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like I don't, I charge very little. Very little. I charge $250 an hour, so it's like not a ton. And so people are also like, A, why do you coach? B, why don't you charge more if you're actually winning in the games you're playing? And my answer is always like, look, I am X good poker player. That is worth X amount of money. I am X good coach, and that is worth this amount of money. I don't have the experience as a coach to be, I'll bring you up. And like Kevin's been coaching for like a decade. He has like way more coaching experience than I do. Yeah. So yeah, what are the biggest like things that you feel like, just for me, like if you could tell your prior coaching self something to bring them further, or to like give them some piece of advice, what would that be?
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, the obvious thing that comes to mind for me is that when I was coaching without thinking about what my student needed, I don't think I was a particularly good coach. I think what I've come to understand that I was doing was kind of more of like instruction, or I was being like an instructor the same way I am on Run It Once. And I was just having that conversation with an individual person about like their chosen topic, right?
Right.
So I think that that's valuable. I don't think that I was like a bad coach because I was more of an instructor, but all of the advice that I would give to my former self would be kind of framed in the way of understanding the difference between like a coach and an instructor, or like the coach and a smart player, right? So these are things like just understanding, the variable needs of a student, right? Understanding variable learning methods, making an effort to identify the problems in your student's thought process or game or situation, whatever it is, and addressing them directly, rather than just like, that's not my problem, I'm just here to teach you, heads up, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
I think as I've gotten better and just seen more versions of coaching, I've started to recognize all the ways that I could take responsibility for the improvement of my student. And it's not always like the clean transfer of knowledge that I was expecting it to be when I was more of a player.
Yeah.
So I think that's like, yeah, maybe advice for you or for any player who's thinking about coaching, or just for my former self when I was a player, is like transfer of knowledge isn't like, it's not going to happen the same way that it happened for me, right? Like I can't just assume that my experience learning poker is going to be the same experience that all my students have.
Yeah.
All that's going to do is it's going to like match you up with a handful of students who synchronize with your methods, and then you'll probably get that natural positive feedback of like, hey, these guys got it, and look at how great they are now. But you're just not going to sync with like that many students. And I don't know if that's like necessarily the goal of a coach, is to like reach every single student that comes their way,
right?
Or to connect with every single student that comes their way. But I think the better I get as a coach, the more successful I've been at just connecting with different types of students.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably true. And I think it's similar with a lot of skills, where it's like the more like you sort out your own motivations for doing something, I think the more you sort of just become open to being available to the needs of other people, And I think like what gets in my way always, because I'm a new coach, just like what gets in my way at poker at times, is like being when you're insecure at the poker table, you just like, you're not really available to all the things available to you. And when I'm coaching and I feel insecure about like, am I really doing this well? That's really just attention taken away from the student and placed on myself from myself, And
sometimes like I've definitely, and this isn't like something I've left behind entirely, but I've definitely left coaching sessions feeling kind of like, I don't know if I did a very good job in that session, or like left sessions feeling like, I don't know if I really like connected the way that I wanted to connect with the thing they were saying. And then like maybe I get a message back from that same person that says like, today was great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, it was?
Yeah. I've had that. Yeah.
There's often this, and like it's not like I get that message every time, right? Like that's probably a 5 or 10% type of response that I get after a coaching session. So to know that I can feel that way, maybe because like I didn't get my point across or something, and then to realize like that was completely different from what the student was experiencing, helps me like get out of my own head a little bit, right? Like I need to remember that the way that I'm experiencing that interaction is not the way they are. And to some extent it's on them to let you know like, hey, this isn't really working for me. But
sure.
Well, I think if you're just kind of open to them, you get more perceptive to the times where it's not working for them.
Yeah, I think I feel I put a lot of I will move on from this because it's probably not that interesting to people. It's just two coaches talking about coaching. But I think I put a lot of pressure on myself because of the fact that someone's paying me. Right? Sure. Like then I feel like a lot of pressure when it's like, man, I don't think this is going well. And then it can kind of snowball in the session because like, man, I don't think this is going well. And then I get more worried about it. And it's like, oh, say something good. Like, you know, make it good.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a short-term mentality too, right? Like that's this idea that like every hour needs to hit the value of that hour. And like I mean, maybe not every coaching relationship is like this, but the more I move towards like kind of the framework of mentorship and like away from the framework of coaching, it's maybe relieving to think like, okay, this is a long-term project. I've got time. I can message them later. I can correct. I can tell them in the next session to do something differently than I told them in the last session. Like this hour is not the end of our relationship, right? So it's maybe like an unrealistic expectation for like every coaching session to go perfect.
Yeah, that's good advice. So given some of the stuff you said, I'm assuming the answer to this is yes, but how much of your coaching then do you feel like you actually end up focusing on soft skills, mental game, you know, things of this nature?
Yeah, more and more. Like it wasn't always the case. I think when I was more specialized as a coach, I was not getting those kinds of requests or concerns from my students. So, you know, when all I played was heads up, people would come to me with like very specific strategic information they were trying to take away. They just wanted to get better at heads up, and nothing else really would come up, and that was fine. I work with a lot more students now. I work with students with different things in mind, and it's way more common for me to just recognize like, hey, the way you're talking about this, like I have a feeling that you're ignoring like, you know, this part of the game, or the way that you're strategizing in this area. Like I have a feeling you're afraid of something that could happen if we did this instead. So like that's, I don't know, 75% of my coaching now, when it used to be like almost zero. At the same time, part of that is because solvers exist now, and like I can just assign homework, or I can recommend references, or I can send solutions, whatever. So I think that the way that I'm spending my time on the call is like optimizing for that. The fact that if there's like a number or a stat or a solution or whatever that the student needs, I can just send it to them later. Like we don't need to talk about it.
That's true. Yeah, I think it's also surprisingly, maybe unsurprisingly, the biggest bang for your buck in terms of time, even though too, like some concepts to distill strategically can, like, you have to practice, you have to study, like we could spend a lot of hours doing that. But if I can just point out like, hey, maybe you're just really more uncomfortable here than you're giving yourself credit for, or something like that, that can instantly sort of like turn around the way somebody plays a spot. You know what I mean? And I've noted, I've had like a single session with, you know, people where we just that's all we talk about, and they say like their game feels totally different instantly. You know what I mean? And I think mental game and stuff like that can end up just being like the most, like the 80-20, like you're just getting so much more for like talking about so much less.
It's kind of something I want to like lean into a little more. I think like even now that I'm coaching more of those soft skills, I still kind of shy away from like mental game coaching. I think that's, I don't know, just maybe feeling not prepared or not well studied in that arena. And like as I'm, you know, receiving mental game coaching, I'm starting to understand more of what that looks like, and maybe how I could present that to students. But I do think that ideally you wouldn't have to work with 2 or 3 or 4 different coaches
Yeah.
as a student who has like 2 or 3 or 4 different needs, right? So it would be good, I think, for me. This was actually like I was having a conversation with Lee Davey on his podcast not long ago, and he was sort of encouraging me to think about coaching in this way, right? Because like nobody knows that students' problems better than their main coach, right? Like their primary person. So to tell them like, yeah, you've got this problem, but like that's not for me. Go somewhere else. That's it's not good for me, but it's also not good for them. For them to have to like separate that conversation from the rest of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, it's tough. I have leaned into the mental game stuff, I think, a bit prematurely for myself, honestly. Like, doing the mental game, it's a lot. I find there's way more at stake with mental game coaching than strategic coaching, right? Like, getting mental game advice wrong can trickle out into so many other areas of somebody's life, you know, and like, and it's there's a lot more. I feel a lot more of responsibility when I start trying to get into that sort of mental game stuff. It's difficult because so much of it revolves around things like acceptance and you know, shout out to Jason Su, like presence and stuff like that. You find yourself, if you find yourself unaccepting of a tendency of somebody, and you sort of project that onto them, well, it doesn't matter what you're telling them, it doesn't matter what you're saying to them. You could be telling them to like be more, and this is why Jason has such a palpable presence with this, right? Like his presence is so, I won't repeat it, palpable. But like it is, like you can feel feel he does a really good job. Just being there for it. You know what I mean? Just being, you can tell like he's there for it, and he's there for you, and it's when you start walking into the mental game space, there's more of a, for lack of a better word, responsibility to just like to harbor that well, I think, because it affects so much of people's well-being. That being said, I think it is, the more that I've sort of leaned into some of the mental game stuff, even though I feel like at times I've been like, man, I really did not do that well, it has put me in a position, like so many other things, to get better at it, you know what I mean? To like start getting better at it. And it's really rewarding, I've noticed, getting better at mental game coaching, because it also just makes me feel like the skills, I think, to do that well translate well to just like relationships and friendships and conversations and stuff. And
it's a good life skill.
So perfect transition. Do you think poker's helped you much in other areas of your life that are not poker related?
Yeah, I mean, in some places I think it helped. I think in some places it hurt. It's thinking about the mental game aspect of the, I don't know, just the poker lifestyle, or like the methods that I use to get good at poker early in my career, especially, I think framed the way that I like thought about a lot of stuff, and framed the way that I approached a lot of decision making and stuff, and what that, I guess, looks like. So I'm thinking about the kind of EV model that you might find yourself applying to like everything, right?
Yeah.
I think poker players are very good decision makers because they are very capable of making like probabilistic simplifications or whatever, some sort of model to say like, here's the different paths we could go down, here's roughly the value of those paths, I choose this one, the high value one, right?
Yeah.
So they become really good decision makers in terms of like, I don't know, financial decisions, or I don't know, like career decisions, or anything that can be distilled down into a number. I became very capable of that, and just like sharp, for lack of a better word, right? So in that way it helps areas of life. I think with this, like the reason I think mental game coaching is so big now is that it also turns you into like a soulless EV robot that needs like extremely difficult work just to have like a regular relationship with a person.
So
that part is interesting. Like it hasn't like caused any problems in my life. This isn't some, like, I'm not suggesting that this has created like a major rift or something with other people. But it's just interesting that I found this like direct correlation between how like invested I was in poker with how poorly my like interpersonal skills or like my just interaction with like non-poker people, how poorly that was going at the same time.
Yeah.
And I had to like almost pull myself away from poker community to some extent to like get better perspective on how to interact with the rest of the world. I don't know that that's like necessary. It just felt better for me. Like I think that all of my friends who don't play poker, all the people in my life who don't play poker, I have like better interactions with them when I'm not in that poker mindset, right? Like when I'm not in that sort of, I don't know, EV model.
Yeah, that's you know, probably there's a economist named Russ Roberts. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he wrote a book and he describes these two problems as tame problems and wild problems. And like tame problems can be like quantified. They can be drawn down to numbers. But you have wild problems, which are arguably the things that matter most to us, which are things like, how do I find happiness? Do I get married? Do I have kids? Do I, do I move from one place to another? And if you treat wild problems like tame problems, you can kind of come up short. There's a funny thought experiment that sort of can demonstrate how the EV model can go really wrong too. And it's called Pascal's, not Pascal's wager, but Pascal's, I can bet, I think. And if you, or something like that, but if it's imagine you leave a bar and a man walks up to you and says, if you give me $100, I'll return with any amount of well-being that you ask for, right? So if you give me $100, I'll come back and I'll give you like the most amount of well-being you could possibly receive. If you're using like a strict EV model, even if you, however unlikely you rate that he comes back and is able to do this for you, he tells you he's a god. However unlikely this is, it's worth more than $100 because it could be a 0.0001%, whatever chance, but he's going to give you all the well-being in the world that you could possibly imagine. So it's certainly worth more than $100. And I just think that's always a funny thought experiment of where the EV model sort of breaks down, and the way logicians and mathematicians get around it is they just say there's a bounded value function on like well-being. Like well-being can only get so good and stuff like that. So there are things that are so unlikely that it's like, but anyway, it's just like,
I thought it was just going to be putting a price on your life and putting a price on your,
But I mean,
that's how an insurance company would approach it. And that would, they could certainly calculate it.
Yeah. That is interesting though. I haven't thought about the things that, have I haven't been in poker as long as you, so I have explicitly noticed things that I feel like I do better because of poker. But
yeah, I mean, I just like, maybe it's because of the conversation we were having before you asked that question, but like I'm reminded of all the times that I heard the argument, and this was going back to the 2+2 forms again, but how often the times like you're doing something and then they present the argument that like if you're not making better than your poker hourly while doing that thing, then you should be paying someone to do it. Or like if you're not saving more than your poker hourly in doing that thing, then you should be paying someone to do it, or you should stop doing it altogether. And I'm just like, no, like there's just like so much resistance that I have to that model.
Well, that's really a poor EV model though when you think about it, because what you really are, you're not pricing in, you're taking something quantitative, which is money, and you're not pricing in just how much it is rewarding to just enjoy doing things for their own sake, right? Like, just being there, doing something, just maintaining whatever it is you're doing. There's deep. That's where life is lived, is in that moment. And if you're constantly comparing what you're doing with how much money you could be making, that's a really good way to have a very shitty life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Okay. So, along this too, what were the were there any like super difficult moments you had in poker? Did you ever like want to throw in the towel and be like, fuck this game, I'm not doing this anymore?
I've been pretty fortunate in the path that I took. Like probably the most difficult financial moment that I experienced was like resolved in relatively short order. Like going through Black Friday was quite I don't want to, like, devastating would be an overstatement. I just lost a lot of money relative to what I had, and was able to pick myself back up through, you know, a network, through skill in the poker games, through having the flexibility to move to Toronto and just like play full time for 2 years straight to make all that money back. So other than that, like, I haven't had major financial setbacks through poker, and I feel quite fortunate for that. And then, like, the only time that I kind of considered quitting was not really because of like I don't know, like a major problem. I think I was just experiencing quite a bit of burnout around the time that I enrolled in culinary school and was playing a lot less poker. I was, you know, I wasn't feeling like sour about it. I wasn't hating poker. I wasn't particularly, I certainly wasn't in a position to retire, and I certainly wasn't in a position where I like needed to grind extra hard. So I think I was just like a little burnt out, and I wanted to see what other paths felt like and see what other, you know, use of my time would feel like. Yeah. And I just kind of ended up playing a whole lot of poker again within 2 years of that. So
and loving sandwiches.
And loving sandwiches. Yeah. All I did was add sandwiches to the
all you did. You went through all that. You were like, it's all. Turns out it's just all about the sandwich. Last couple questions here, and then if you will indulge maybe a couple Discord questions, and we'll call it.
Of course.
So these two questions are kind of related, but like these are much more about. I spoke with Jason about this, and I think I've spoken with you privately a couple times about this, but just like what do you think of like the poker overlap with like hustle mindset? Like I see there being like a lot of tweets, content created that feel very, you know, tangential to the hustle culture of like, all of that stuff. What do you think of all that?
I mean, it's interesting because it's hard for me to see, like, poker's a really difficult competitive arena right now.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I'm like taking it the way that you were intending, but when I think of like hustle culture, I guess I just kind of think of, you know, someone who's not particularly devoted to the game, someone who's not particularly, you know, in love with what they're doing, and just like finds a way to manufacture a career or manufacture like success out of this space. And that seems quite hard to do successfully or sustainably. Maybe that's not important to someone in that position. Like maybe sustainability isn't really front of mind for them. But it's just not the way that I have ever thought about the game. And again, it's perhaps this like overly optimistic, like detachment from results that I'm, you know, that we talked about at the beginning of this. But a lot of people say with you know, more than just poker, that you shouldn't really be in the game if you don't love it, if you don't like inherently want to be participating in it. And to just get better at it and have some kind of motivation outside of the income that you're getting. So it's not like concerning to me in any way. It's not surprising necessarily, but also think a lot of people who would put out that kind of material probably have something financial to gain from the people who would be hustling. I'm imagining like CFP like owners or something like that. I don't know if that's who you're thinking of when you talk about that.
I mean, it's that. I think I'm more thinking of actually the opposite person who I think would be the real victim of this, which is the person who does love the game and then is sort of sold this meme that success in the game only requires you do A, B, and C. You follow this formulaic approach and you hustle, right? That's like where like it's kind of like with hustle culture. It's like success in life is just like you get up, you do these things, like you have this you have this routine, and then you'll crush it. And then like, and I'm more viewing the overlap being that kind of mentality, which I see where it's like, hey, for success in poker, you just need this, this, and this, and while that technically may be true, it's like that's not really the whole picture. You know what I mean? That's not really the whole picture. And even the I don't know, the picture of like, yeah, it's just consistency, just these reductionistic like sort of views of as opposed to like what it's really like to go through it. And for people who are like committed to it, pulling their hair out, and then keep getting fed these memes of like, oh, if you just fix this, this, and this, you'll be a success. Right. I see now that I'm streaming and now that I talk to more and more people, I just have much more points of contact. And I think because of my life background, with people who are in that frame of mind, who are convinced. There's this funny quote about Americans that says every American views themselves as a temporary embarrassed millionaire. And I'm viewing more and more like there's this creating more and more of that kind of idea around poker, where it's like I will be a high stakes crusher at some point. Like poker just wants commitment from me, you know?
Right.
And I'm seeing just the negative consequences of this that I think I haven't seen spoke about much, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of the way you're describing it, like the people who truly commit themselves to the game and like are not reducing it to those sorts of whatever short form like descriptions, it seems unlikely to me that they would ever fall behind someone who's taking, you know, the hustle approach, right?
Yeah.
I would think that if the measure of success that you're after is longevity in the game and you know, a sustainable career without having to constantly pivot, then you can't take this like kind of reduced hustle approach. I think that's the type of person who's going to like come into poker for a year or two, maybe make like $100,000 over that span of time, and then like hit their first major roadblock and just peace out to the next thing that you know presents a similar sort of opportunity. And that's fine. Like I just, it's hard to imagine that there's many people who will last in poker who have that mentality or who will contribute in any substantial way to the ecosystem. They'll probably just pop in. Some of them will lose, some of them will win. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I know people who have been grinding at poker for 10 years. You know, like, you know, grinding. True. And like, and I guess where I'm standing is not so much the people who come in, if you come in, make a few $100,000 or whatever and like leave, like that's great for you. The people where like I really have compassion for is the people who have been grinding for 10 years. It's just not in the cards for them to be a professional player, right? But they believe it is, because of the content that gets put out there. That's like, if you just do A, B, and C, you will succeed. And like I said, on paper that might be true, but A, B, and C might just not be in the cards for this person. And I view hustle culture similarly, right? Where it's like, it's feeding on people who, I know people again who have been hustling their whole lives, you know, and it's not like they've made some short-term success. They've had no success, you know, and they just believe success is around the corner. Like it's coming soon. You know what I mean? If I just keep committing, if I just keep putting in my time, keep grinding, like I'm going to get it. And I think 90% of poker players are that, right? Like probably like 90% of poker players are people who've been trying really hard and really stake their self-worth on their ability to succeed at this game, you know? And it's like it's fine. And the more I see that content, the more it's like I feel like it just perpetrates like people despising themselves. You know what I mean? Like if it's just A, B, and C, I've been doing this for 10 years. What's wrong with me that I can't do A, B, and C? You know?
Yeah. That's interesting. And I guess it again makes me think that like having a different measure of success is so much healthier than what you're describing, right? Like, like that person who feels the need to post like some amount of money per year. Maybe it's because they have to, like maybe it's because they're, you know, financially dependent on it. But maybe it's also because they like don't see poker for what it is in their life. Like maybe they're convinced that they're you know, a semi-professional or an aspiring professional and they're actually a recreational player. Or like they're convinced that they're gonna make their way into high stakes, and they're actually just not going to. And yeah, I mean, I would. It's tricky. I don't know whose responsibility it is to tell them. I mean, who's like who's the person in their life who needs to present that information. Maybe it's nobody who really needs to take that responsibility. But certainly, it sounds like if you were coaching them, you would you would make a point.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there should be more, and this is kind of why I bring this stuff up with the conversations I brought it up with Jason. I don't think it necessarily is anybody's responsibility in the sense that like you ought to or ought like be putting this out differently, but I just want to create more content that makes it clear to people that it's like it's okay that you don't play this game, or like this game, or that you're not a professional, or that like just you being right where you're at is totally fine. You don't have to have this like long reaching goal. And I just have noticed a particular lack of content like that, which goes to like my last question, which is just really the reason this matters to me. And I didn't want to turn my conversation with Jason into a debate, so I avoided this, but like it, cause he was saying it's not anybody's responsibility, but I do view poker as particularly unique from other ventures where the professionals affect way more people than than other professionals in other fields could, because of the ease of access to it, right? Like it's so easy to get to, anyone can start, because the game makes it hard to know if you're good at it, right? Because like all of the elements of poker, I think there is a bit more of responsibility for the people who know better to not hurt the people who don't know better, and not like them directly hurting them, but creating the system that allows people just to suffer more. And if you're a recreational and you just have fun playing, and you have the money and you don't care, that's one thing. But then creating the culture where like everyone's like, oh no, I can succeed at this, and that'd be my what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I would be curious to know what percentage of like the poker economy depends on those people losing.
Yeah.
Because it might be surprising, I think, to some people to see how much money is lost by aspiring professionals.
Yeah.
Now I don't know how much that would like. I go back and forth on this too, because like, is the responsibility of the professional to maintain the ecosystem? I don't know. I mean, not necessarily. Like I think I hear a lot of conversation among professionals, like, let's go back to why do you coach, or like, why do you help train people, right? I think that views it through a lens of like, there's X amount of money to be won, and the pros who exist right now want to keep it for themselves.
Yeah.
So anything that helps people get better hurts their economy.
Yeah.
Not the economy, but their economy.
Yeah.
And for that reason, they think it's like not a good idea to teach other people to play better. Now, perhaps I would say, and I would agree with you in the sense that I think there's an ethical responsibility that supersedes the like financial responsibility.
Yeah.
Which is, if we see predatory behavior, if we see people who are being taken advantage of in the system, if we see people who are like, I don't know, I'm sure as a live player, you've always seen like the uncomfortable situation of like someone rolling in blackout drunk to come play at the table,
and everyone frothing at the
mouth.
And it's
like, well, are we excited about this, or are we uncomfortable about this, right? Like there's this internal struggle there. And I've certainly even seen that online. Like you just play certain people online and you just know like there's no chance. Like they're not here to compete. Like they're here to lose their money.
Yeah.
So there's a tricky situation, and I think part of me as a professional gambler doesn't want to like get on his high horse and like speak about morality to people, because like probably a good chunk of my income has come from people who are unfortunately like caught up in gambling addiction or whatever like predatory system that exists here. I'm always kind of a proponent of like shifting that responsibility onto operators, companies who offer the services, regulators who control the services, things of that nature. But at the same time, like I think as a good person, not necessarily just as a pro poker player, but as a good person, like it's important to point out these things and to speak to the kind of stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it matters a lot once you have a voice. Like once you are a public figure and you represent the game in some way, I'm I'm not like gonna get on my high horse about anybody in terms of like what anyone should be doing, but I'm totally fine with saying what you shouldn't be doing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, and what you shouldn't be doing, in my opinion, is putting out content that just makes all of this worse, right? That just makes it harder for people that is, in my opinion, dishonest. Like, but because you think you can make money from it. You know, like that. And what I think is dishonest is the painting of the game where it's like it just requires this and you'll succeed, or any of the stuff where it's just like, yeah, I don't know. The line gets blurry for me, and I've spoken with you about this before too. Like, I don't know where I stand on, like what because a lot of the things you just said also make me uncomfortable, right? They also make me uncomfortable thinking about like, yeah, I mean, someone punts off money online at 2K. That I've seen this many times. Someone joins Iggy, plays 5 hands. I say many times, not that many, but 5 hands. They're all in each hand. They lose 10K. They leave. You know, and it's like, I don't like the part of me that's like sick. I don't know who that guy was. Maybe he has millions of dollars and he's just here messing around and he's fine. You know what I mean? But
you know, probabilistically,
probably not. Yeah, probably he had 10K burning a hole in his pocket and he thought he'd run it up. But yeah, so it's just, I don't know. But what I think should just happen is like I said, conversations they're so much better than no conversations about it. You know what I mean? Just like for me, like I just want to do more of like calling a spade and just be like, even though as a coach and as a player, it's just the fact that like a lot of players are losing, right? A lot of players are losing. A lot of players aren't going to make money, and it's not as like as a denigrating them fact, right? It's like that's fine. That's fine that's how it is, and that like if you have fun playing poker, keep having fun playing poker. But for me, and what I think would be true for everybody is like poker should be a facet to your life. It shouldn't be your life. And so if you're guiding your ethical decisions and what you want to do or not do based on maintaining poker in your life, then I think you've sort of lost track of what matters, in my opinion. But,
yeah. I think that's a fair stance.
Yeah,
I would tend to agree.
Yeah. Cool. So we'll bust out really quick. I'll pick the best Discord questions, like 1 or 2, and then we'll call it because I know I've had you for a long time.
Cool.
Let's see. I'm trying to find. I have like 8 here, so I have to pick. This is interesting. What did your family and friends think when you decided to pursue poker as a career? Any advice on how to talk about playing professionally to others when it comes up, knowing that they're going to think you're a degen?
Well, that's an interesting way to frame it. Why do we know they're going to think we're a degen?
Yeah.
I mean, I've actually never, I shouldn't say never, but perhaps I'm just like blindly confident. I have not really considered before that someone I told that I play professionally would like just frame me as a degenerate and like write me off in some way. Yeah, I don't think that's the common perception. I've come across 1 or 2 people certainly who just kind of had their like, you know, they furrow their brow and they're like poker, like that you can make money at that, and you can like tell that they're quite skeptical, which is fine. But I would say like, I don't know, at this point in my life, I've probably told over 500 people who have never played poker before that I play poker professionally, and like 498 of them were just like, wow, that's cool, like tell me more about that. My family was super supportive. I was lucky to have that. I think my dad like brags about it all the time. He maybe doesn't think he's bragging, but like he does. And my mom was a little hesitant at first, but like started to see me, you know, I think she's just excited that like within whatever little community I'm, you know, something, right? I'm up there making an influence. Like I have peers who respect me. Like that's what seemed to matter. I don't know. I don't think you should be afraid of like talking to people about poker. I think that's mostly an internal thing.
Yeah.
And it just comes across. And I definitely felt that way at first. Like the conversation used to be, when, you know, let's say when I was in high school or college, the conversation was a lot more hesitant. I would like, you know, get in a taxi and like not want to bring it up. I would go, you know, I'd meet someone on campus and not want to bring it up. I just like started doing it and slowly got more comfortable with it.
I think
it's important to be like confident about what you do, right? Like it's important to be proud of what you're doing, I guess is a better way to say it.
Yeah. I think you bring your own weather to conversations like that too, in the sense that like the more ashamed and like nervous and anxious you are about mentioning it, I think the more inclined people are to think you're doing something shady, right? Like if you're like, I don't know, I'm a poker player. Like,
and they pick up on that skepticism. They're like, oh, so like, how long are you going to try that for? Until you get a real job. And it's like, shit. Like, I made it obvious that I'm uncomfortable about this.
Yeah. Let's see. Man, these are just like they're just gonna take too long of answers. I'll answer this because this is something for us both to say, but I'd say it says they'd like me to talk about the breakthroughs and the aha moments that I've had in coaching with you, and then for you to mention other like big breakthroughs you think other students have had. For me, I can say I think there was one. I've referenced this before. People have asked me before, what was the thing I got the most from? Like, we've only done a handful of coaching sessions together, maybe but there was one statement that there was one conversation we were having where we were talking about designing a strategy against a known leak where people were under folding. So we were basically talking about like not bringing our bluffs into this line, and the conversation was basically like, well, if I have no bluffs in this line, what do I do on turn? Like when I get check raised or something, and like I have nothing but like my strong nutted hands. Like how do I play this spot? And it was much more of like, that'll be weird, and and not like we shouldn't do this, but like it was much more like, I think you just said like, I think really good players just like don't shy away from uncomfortable situations like that. Don't shy away from spots like that, And that was, for me, that was a big breakthrough. And combine that with, I think, just times you had said, like, don't give people too much credit. Like, don't give people, they're not reading your soul in every hand. They don't know what you're up to in every hand. I would say those were the two biggest breakthroughs I had in coaching, was like, the more I've just become willing to like, think I see something that will make me money, attack that, and deal with the aftermath, like deal with the aftermath after that, and just be like, and just learn from it. And that doesn't mean you always make the right decision, but you can always like just learn from it.
I find, those are cool examples for me to hear. Like I find that the types of, I guess we'll call them breakthroughs, like the types of stuff that sticks with students where they like come back to me and they say like, this is the thing that made a huge difference in my game. Very often it is that like breakdown of a misconception, and it's not like something strategic or something like specific. It's usually just like, oh, we got to this point in the conversation where we noticed that like every time I'm in this spot, I get stuck with a certain thought, or like I've framed it, I've like closed in my thought process in a certain way. So an example might be like, we go down a bluff catching line and we get to the river and we're like stuck in this feeling of, oh, I think I need to call this hand, or like, oh, I think I need to fold this hand, and like recognizing that person has never once considered raising in that spot in like their entire poker career. And getting to that point, like through conversation and like pointing it out in the moment, they kind of like, it can kind of click and unlock like a new node in their own head, right? Like there's blind spots like that exist all over. And like for some people, we just get there by looking at data. That's probably been the most impactful thing that I've noticed in coaching, is just by like looking at data together and talking through data. We just like, I can describe what I'm seeing in the data, and the student will very often be like, you're just describing the way that I think about this situation. And it can be eye-opening in a number of different parts of their game. It's specific to like whatever it is that they're struggling with, obviously. But it's usually just like it's like a wall somewhere in the thought process where we go down that path and we realize like, oh, I've only ever thought of it this one way, and I was missing like part of the story.
Yeah, I can notice that when I'm working with somebody, where I realize like there's almost a moment where you realize I had an assumption, and like I was speaking like we were on the same page, and then you said something that was like, oh, we're not even kind of on the same page. Like, I see. And that's, I've noticed that with students of my own as well. Well, awesome. Kevin, thanks so much. This was a long conversation. I appreciate all your time. It was good.
Happy to do it.
Guys, Kevin's course, the game plan on Run It Once is up right now. Definitely grab it. I have a friend who just crushed through it, and he said it was amazing. So definitely get it. It's going to be great. Awesome.
It's great to hear.
See you guys later.